Vincent Rossi slammed his fist on the conference table so hard that three men flinched backward in their chairs. "I don't care how you do it," he snarled, his voice low and vicious. "I want Moretti's entire operation buried by Friday. Every account, every shipment, every person who breathes his name." He leaned forward, his gold ring catching the light as he pointed at the lawyer seated at the end of the table. "And if that little girl in his office has already seen too much, she doesn't leave the building alive." No one spoke. No one dared. That is where the story begins. Not with a hero, not with a rescue, but with a death sentence signed against a 24-year-old woman who had no idea her name was already on a list. If this is your first time here, welcome. Please subscribe to the channel, hit the notification bell, and follow this story all the way to the end. And drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from right now. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. The eviction notice had been taped to Emily Carter's apartment door for the third time in 4 months, and she had gotten so used to the sick feeling it gave her that she barely stopped walking when she saw it. She just reached out, peeled it off the door with 2 fingers like it was something dead, folded it in half without reading it, and tucked it behind the stack of identical notices she kept in the kitchen drawer, beside the expired coupons and the last birthday card her mother had ever written her. That drawer had become a kind of graveyard. Emily stood in the center of her Brooklyn apartment and did the math in her head the way she did every single morning. Rent overdue by 63 days. Medical debt from her mother's final hospitalization sitting at $42,000. Balance in her checking account, $211, and that had to cover subway fare, groceries, and the asthma inhaler. She had been stretching for 6 weeks longer than the prescription allowed. She was 24 years old and already exhausted in the kind of way that had nothing to do with sleep. Her phone buzzed on the counter. It was a text from the staffing agency, the third one this morning. She had missed the first 2 because she had been in the shower standing under lukewarm water and trying to convince herself that today would be different from yesterday. The message read, "Emily, final opportunity, executive secretary position, Moretti Logistics, Midtown Manhattan. Start immediately. Compensation $4,000 per week." She read it twice. Then she read it a third time because the number didn't make sense. $4,000 a week was more than she had made in the last 3 months combined. It was the kind of number that appeared in job listings she had stopped clicking on because they always turned out to be scams or sales positions that required you to pay for your own training kit, or companies that folded before the first paycheck cleared. She typed back one word: details. The response came in under 30 seconds. Moretti Logistics, CEO is Damien Moretti. You would be his personal executive secretary. Hours are non-traditional. Discretion required. Previous candidates found the environment challenging. Salary is non-negotiable and begins day 1. Emily set the phone down and stared at the eviction notice she had just placed on the counter. She had heard of Damien Moretti. Everyone in New York had heard of Damien Moretti. He was in the business section of every major newspaper at least once a month. Youngest CEO to control a billion-dollar logistics company on the East Coast. Rebuilt 3 failing port operations from nothing. Was photographed at charity galas with senators, foreign dignitaries, and occasionally people whose names Emily recognized from crime documentaries she had watched late at night when she couldn't sleep. There were also the other stories, the ones that didn't appear in newspapers. Her neighbor, a retired office manager named Gloria, who had worked in Midtown for 30 years, had mentioned Moretti's name once at a building mailbox and then immediately crossed herself like someone had walked over her grave. "Nobody lasts in that building," Gloria had said, pulling her mail out with shaking hands. "My friend's niece applied there last year. Quit after 4 days. Wouldn't say why. Just said she quit. Young girl, tough girl, just quit." Emily had laughed at the time. She wasn't laughing now. She picked up the phone and typed, "I'll take it. What time do I start?" The agency responded, "Tomorrow, 7 a.m. sharp, 42nd floor. Do not be late. Mr. Moretti does not acknowledge late arrivals." Emily looked around her apartment, at the bare walls where she had taken down her mother's photographs because looking at them made it impossible to function. At the second-hand couch with the broken armrest she had fixed 3 times with duct tape. At the single plant on the windowsill that was somehow still alive, despite the fact that she had been forgetting to water it for 2 weeks. She said out loud to no one, to the empty apartment, to her mother's ghost, if it was listening, Okay, I can do this." She believed it approximately 40%. The morning arrived gray and wet. A hard October rain coming down sideways across the Brooklyn Bridge. As Emily stood on the subway platform in her best secondhand blazer, her hair already losing the battle against the humidity, holding a tote bag that contained a notepad, 2 pens and a banana she had grabbed on the way out because she had forgotten to eat actual breakfast. She had spent the previous night looking up Moretti Logistics online with a specific intention of calming herself down and had instead made everything significantly worse. Moretti Logistics controlled 6 commercial ports along the eastern seaboard. The company had revenues approaching $3 billion annually. It employed over 4,000 people directly and tens of thousands more through subsidiary contracts. Damien Moretti had been named to Forbes' list of America's most powerful executives 4 years in a row. He was also 34 years old, which struck Emily as deeply unfair. There were photographs of him. Of course there were photographs of him. He was the kind of man that cameras found automatically the way certain people simply occupied more visual space than everyone around them. Dark hair, sharp jaw suit that probably cost more than 3 months of her rent. In every photograph, he looked like he was thinking about something significantly more important than whoever was speaking to him, and that expression, distant controlled. Evaluating made Emily's stomach tighten in a way that she categorized as professional concern and nothing else whatsoever. She had also found 3 separate forum threads in the darker corners of the internet where anonymous users claimed to have worked at Moretti Logistics and described an environment that ranged from intensely high pressure to genuinely terrifying, to one post that simply read, "I can't talk about it. If you know, don't take the job." Emily had closed the laptop, then as she had opened it again and looked at the eviction notice she had photographed and stored in her files. Then she had closed it again and gone to sleep. The Moretti Logistics building was 42 stories of dark glass in the center of Midtown, the kind of architecture that communicated power without trying the way extremely dangerous animals didn't need to make noise to be threatening. Emily stood on the sidewalk in the rain for 30 seconds longer than necessary, looking up at it, and then she straightened her blazer, adjusted the strap of her tote bag, and walked through the front door. The lobby was marble in silence. 2 security guards at the front desk looked at her the way border agents look at travelers with too many bags. She gave her name. One of them made a phone call. The other one watched her without blinking in a way that she found medically concerning. After 2 minutes that felt significantly longer, she was handed a visitor badge and directed to an elevator bank at the far end of the lobby. A woman in a perfectly tailored gray suit met her at the elevator and on the 42nd floor. She was somewhere in her 40s, immaculate, in the way that suggested significant personal discipline, and she looked at Emily's second-hand blazer and rain-damp hair with an expression that was professionally neutral, but privately pitying. "Emily Carter," the woman said. It was not a question. "Yes, that's me. Hi, yes." Emily stopped talking. The woman's name was Mrs. Helena Voss, and she was the executive floor manager, which Emily understood to mean she was the person who dealt with the chaos that the CEO left behind him. She walked Emily through the floor at a brisk pace, speaking in a low-controlled voice that left no room for questions. "Mr. Moretti arrives at 7:45. His espresso is prepared at 7:43. 2 shots, no milk. Temperature exactly 85 degrees Celsius. If it is wrong, do not apologize. Simply correct it and do not let it happen again. His schedule is on the system and is not to be discussed with anyone outside this floor. Phone calls are screened, all of them. If someone tells you it is urgent, it is probably not. If someone tells you it is not urgent, treat it as urgent. Documents are filed same day, no exceptions. Are you following?" "Yes," Emily said. "Your predecessor," Helena said, pausing slightly on the word in a way that gave it weight, "found the role demanding." "How long did she last?" Emily asked. Helena glanced at her sideways. 4 days. "What happened?" Helena stopped walking. She turned to look at Emily fully, and her expression did something complicated for half a second before returning to neutral. She made a personal phone call on the executive floor. Mr. Moretti overheard. She was escorted out within the hour. She paused. The one before her lasted 6 days. She forwarded an internal document to the wrong email address. Accidentally. Another pause. These are the ones who simply left. Emily understood there were others she was not going to elaborate on. "I won't make those mistakes," Emily said. "No," Helena said in a tone that was not agreement, but rather the polite professional equivalent of, "We'll see. Come." He arrives in 8 minutes. The executive secretary desk was a clean expanse of dark wood positioned directly outside two large double doors that Emily understood immediately were the ones you did not open without being told to. The office behind them was Damien Moretti's, and even through 2 inches of solid wood, the space behind them felt different from the rest of the floor. Heavier, like the air pressure changed near the door. Emily sat down. She located the espresso machine along the far wall. She noted the temperature settings. She found the schedule on the system and began reading it with the focus of someone preparing for an exam worth their entire grade. At 7:42, she started the espresso. At 7:43, 2 shots pulled perfectly. Temperature checked. At 7:45, the elevator opened. She heard him before she saw him. Not loudly. That was the thing that surprised her. She had expected someone who filled a room with noise the way powerful men so often did, raising their voices to remind everyone of their size. Instead, she heard a low, brief exchange in Italian between Damien Moretti and the 2 men flanking him. 3 words and then silence, and then footsteps that were measured and deliberate and absolutely certain of themselves. He came around the corner, and Emily's first coherent thought was that photographs had not been honest with her, and her second coherent thought was that she was going to stand up with the espresso cup and introduce herself professionally and not do anything that could be classified as a disaster. She stood. She picked up the cup. She turned. Her foot caught the edge of the desk leg. It happened in the specific, slow-motion way that genuine catastrophes always did, where her brain registered every stage of what was occurring without being able to stop any of it. The cup tilted. Her hand overcorrected. The espresso 2 perfect shots at precisely 85 degrees Celsius left the cup in a single decisive arc and landed directly on the chest of Damien Moretti's custom charcoal Italian suit. The floor went absolutely silent. Not the polite silence of people pretending not to notice something. The deep, held breath silence of people waiting to see what happened when an immovable object met a consequence it hadn't anticipated. Emily stood holding an empty cup. Damien Moretti stood completely still, looking down at the dark stains spreading across his jacket. Everyone in the vicinity who was not Emily or Damien was looking at Emily with the specific expression of people watching someone step off a ledge. "I am so sorry," Emily said. Her voice came out remarkably steady, which surprised her because inside her chest her heart had relocated somewhere near her throat. "I caught the desk. I'm so sorry. That was entirely my fault, and She stopped. She reached into the tote bag she had set beside the desk and pulled out the napkins she had grabbed from the coffee cart in the lobby because she had spilled her own coffee on the subway and had learned to carry napkins. She held them out. Damien Moretti looked at the napkins. He looked at her. He looked at the napkins again. His 2 associates, both large, both wearing the specific blank expression of men paid to remain expressionless in all circumstances, had their hands inside their jackets, which Emily noticed and immediately decided she was misinterpreting. "You're the new secretary," Damien said. His voice was even, controlled, accented in the particular way of someone who had learned English as a second language so young that the accent was a texture rather than an obstacle Italian underneath English, like a current beneath still water. "Yes," Emily said. "I'm Emily Carter, and I'm so sorry about your—" "Stop apologizing," he said. She stopped. He looked at her for 2 seconds that contained approximately a decade of evaluation. Then he said, "The espresso, what temperature did you pull it at?" She blinked. 85 Celsius, 2 shots, per your specifications. Something shifted in his expression, almost imperceptible, a fractional adjustment of something behind his eyes. "Did Helena give you those specifications this morning?" "Yes." "And you memorized them?" "I wrote them down," she said, "and then I memorized them." He stood there another moment. Then he turned to one of the men beside him and said 2 words in Italian, and the man turned immediately and walked back toward the elevator. To Emily, he said, "Change of suit is in the executive wardrobe. My 10 o'clock is the Morrison shipping contract review. Have the contract on my desk in 8 minutes with the previous 3 amendment drafts attached in order." He looked at the stain on his jacket one more time with an expression she could not read. "And make another espresso." He walked through the double doors. They closed behind him. The entire floor released a breath. Emily stood there for exactly 3 seconds, and then she sat down, pulled up the document system, located the Morrison contract, located the 3 previous amendments, and printed them in order. 7 minutes and 40 seconds later, she knocked on the double doors. "Come in." She entered and placed the documents on his desk. He was in a fresh suit, dark navy, equally expensive, equally perfect. He did not look up from whatever he was reading. She placed the documents and turned to leave. "Carter," he said. She stopped. "Yes." He still did not look up. The temperature on the second espresso was correct. She had not brought in a second espresso yet. She understood he was telling her that the first one had also been correct. "Thank you," she said, and left before anything else could go wrong. The first week was what Emily could only describe as surviving a curriculum no one had warned her about. The days started before 7:30 and ended after 8 at night. The work itself, the actual secretarial work, she could handle. She was organized in the specific way that people who had grown up managing chaos became organized, not because anyone had taught her systems, but because she had learned early that if she didn't create structure around herself, the disorder of her life would swallow her. She scheduled, she tracked, she anticipated. What she had not anticipated was the other part. By the second day, she had noticed that the men who moved through the 42nd floor did not move like corporate employees. They moved like men who occupied space differently, the specific alert stillness of people who were always calculating the distance to a door, the position of a window, the number of people in a room. She noticed the conversation that happened in Italian in hallways and stopped the moment she walked past. She noticed that the shipping contracts sometimes had amendment clauses written in numerical codes she didn't recognize, and that bore no relation to any standard logistics documentation she had ever processed. She filed them, she printed them, she sent them where she was told to send them. She did not ask questions. She was not stupid. She understood the shape of what surrounded her, the way you understood the shape of a storm from the way the air changed before it arrived. She had grown up in neighborhoods where certain businesses on certain corners didn't ask for your name, and certain men had a quality to their stillness that meant something specific. She recognized the texture of it, but she needed this job, and she was good at it. And so she kept her eyes forward and her questions inside her head, and she focused on the work. On Wednesday of the first week, she accidentally walked into a meeting she had not known was happening. She had knocked twice, which was protocol, and received no response, which was unusual, and entered because she had time-sensitive documents that required Damien's signature before a 3 o'clock Port Authority deadline. The room contained Damien, 3 men she recognized from the floor, and 2 men she had never seen before. One of the unknown men had a scar that ran from his left ear to his chin. The other was sitting with his hands folded on the table in a way that communicated he was entirely comfortable in rooms where other people were not. Every face in the room turned toward her. The temperature of the atmosphere dropped approximately 15 degrees. "I'm so sorry," she said, holding the documents and maintaining eye contact with Damien, specifically because looking at anyone else felt inadvisable. "The Port Authority deadline is at 3 o'clock. I need your signature on the Harrison Amendment before 2:45. Total silence. She walked to the table. She placed the documents in front of Damien. She held out a pen. He looked at her for one very long second. Then he took the pen. He signed 3 places she indicated. He handed the pen back. "Close the door on your way out," he said. She left. She closed the door. She walked back to her desk. She sat down. She noticed her hands were shaking, and she pressed them flat against her thighs until they stopped. 20 minutes later, one of the men from the meeting walked past her desk, the one with the scar. He slowed as he passed and looked at her with an expression she categorized immediately as dangerous assessment. "You're brave," he said. His accent was thick Eastern European or possibly Russian. "I had a deadline," she said without looking up from her screen. He made a sound that might have been a laugh, then he kept walking. At 5 o'clock, Helena appeared at her desk with the particular expression she wore when she was delivering information she considered significant. "You've survived the week," Helena said. Emily looked up. "It's only Thursday." "In this office," Helena said quietly, "Thursday of the first week is the week." That night, after everyone else had left the floor, Emily was finishing a contract cross-reference that had taken longer than expected. The office was nearly empty. The overhead lights had switched to their reduced evening setting, leaving pools of amber light across the long hallway. She was reorganizing the filing credenza behind her desk when she bumped the side panel. The credenza shifted, and behind it on the floor where it had apparently fallen and been hidden for some indeterminate period was a red ledger, not a digital file, not a printed report. An actual physical ledger, the kind that predated computerized record keeping, its red cover worn at the corners, a rubber band around the middle. Emily picked it up. She should have put it on Damien's desk immediately. That was the correct thing to do. That was clearly the appropriate professional action. But the rubber band was broken, and the ledger fell open in her hands, and the numbers on the page in front of her were numbers she recognized because she had been cross-referencing shipping accounts all week, and she could see immediately that they were wrong. Not by accident. They were wrong in the specific, precise, calibrated way that things were wrong when someone had worked very hard to make them look right. She sat down on the floor of the executive hallway with the red ledger in her lap, and she began to read. The shipping calculations were being inflated on outgoing cargo manifests and deflated on incoming payment records. The difference was being siphoned through a series of subsidiary account transfers that looped back through 3 shell companies before disappearing. It was elegant. It was complicated. It would have been invisible to anyone who wasn't sitting in the exact position she had been sitting in all week, cross-referencing both sides of the transaction simultaneously. Someone had been stealing from Damien Moretti. Not small amounts. Not corner-cutting or skimming. The ledger covered 18 months of transactions, and the total running through the hidden accounts was, by her rough calculation, somewhere north of $4 million. Emily sat on the floor for a very long time. Then she stood up. She closed the ledger. She put it under her arm. She walked to the double doors. She knocked. A long pause. Then, "It's after 9 o'clock, Carter." "I know," she said. "I found something. I think you need to see it." Another pause, longer. "Come in." She opened the door. Damien was at his desk, jacket off the sleeves rolled, looking at something on his laptop that he closed the moment she entered. He looked at the red ledger under her arm, and his expression changed in a way she could not fully read, but that told her the ledger meant something to him. "Where did you find that?" he said. It was not a question. It was the voice of someone who had just learned something. "Behind the credenza. I bumped it, and it shifted." She walked to his desk and placed the ledger in front of him. The shipping calculations. Someone has been running a parallel account system through these 3 subsidiaries. She leaned over and opened to the page she had marked with her finger and pointed to the column of figures. The manifest inflations aren't here. The payment deflations are offset by 11 days to avoid triggering the quarterly audit threshold. And the transfer loop exits through this account here, which I cross-referenced this afternoon, and which does not correspond to any vendor name in the approved supplier registry. Damien looked at the page. He looked at it for a long time. Then he looked at her. "You calculated this tonight," he said. "I've been cross-referencing both ledgers all week," she said. "I wasn't looking for anything. I just saw it." He was quiet for a moment that stretched in a direction she couldn't predict. "Sit down, Carter," he said. She sat. "Walk me through it," he said. "All of it, from the beginning." And so she did. For the next 40 minutes in the quiet of his office, at 9:30 on a Thursday night, Emily Carter from Brooklyn walked the most dangerous man in New York through the financial architecture of his own betrayal, line by line, figure by figure, with a clarity and precision that she didn't know she had and that he did not expect from anyone. When she finished, he was quiet again. "The person running this," he said carefully, "had access to both the outgoing manifest system and the subsidiary account transfers." "Yes," she said, "that access is limited to 4 people in this organization." She had not known that, but she understood what it meant. "I only showed you what I found," she said. "I don't know who." He looked at her across the desk, and there was something in his expression that she had not seen there before in the 5 days she had worked for him. It was not warmth exactly. It was something more complicated than warmth. It was the expression of a man who had learned to operate in a world where everyone around him was performing something, performing loyalty, performing competence, performing neutrality, and who had just encountered without warning a person who appeared to be doing none of those things, just telling him what she saw. "Carter," he said. "Yes." "You've survived the week," he said. He said it the same way Helena had, with the same weight behind it. But from him, it meant something entirely different. Emily drove home on the subway at 10:15, with rain hitting the windows and the city running dark and wet outside the glass, and she thought about the red ledger and the 4 names with access to both systems, and the way Damien Moretti had looked at her across his desk at 9:45 at night, like she was something he hadn't expected to find. She thought about the eviction notice in her kitchen drawer. She thought about $4,000 a week. She thought about her mother, who had always told her that the only thing that would ever truly protect her was her brain that no one could take from you. What was inside your head, that smart was the thing that outlasted everything else. Her mother had been right about most things. She pressed her forehead against the cold train window and watched Brooklyn approach through the rain. She had found something tonight that could get her fired. She had found something tonight that could get her killed. And underneath both of those thoughts, quiet and persistent and not entirely comfortable, was a third thought that she was not quite ready to examine. For the first time in a very long time, in that office with the red ledger and the numbers that told the truth sitting across from a man who was listening to her with his complete and total attention. She had felt something that might, in another context, in another life, have been called purpose. The subway pulled into her stop. She gathered her bag. She walked home in the rain. The weekend passed the way weekends did when your brain refused to stop working. Emily sat at her kitchen table both days with her notepad and a cup of coffee that went cold before she remembered to drink it, writing down every number she could remember from the red ledger, every account transfer, every subsidiary name, arranging them in columns, and running the calculations again from memory just to confirm she hadn't made an error on Thursday night. She hadn't. $4,300,000 and approximately $80,000. 18 months, 3 shell companies, and access restricted to 4 people inside Moretti Logistics who could have constructed it. She stared at the numbers until they stopped looking like numbers and started looking like a problem she had no business being anywhere near. Then she thought about the eviction notice. She put the notepad away. She went to bed. Monday morning arrived cold and clear, the kind of New York October day that was beautiful in a way that felt slightly threatening, like the city was dressing up for something. Emily was at her desk at 7:22, espresso already pulled, and at temperature the weekly schedule organized and flagged by priority before Damien's elevator arrived at 7:45. He walked in, saw the espresso waiting, and said nothing. But he took the cup first before his jacket was even off, and that told her something. She filed quietly. The day ran fast and hard. 3 separate conference calls with Port Authority contacts in Baltimore and Savannah. A legal review meeting with 2 men from the corporate counsel office that Emily noticed ran 6 minutes shorter than scheduled because Damien cut it off with a single sentence in Italian that she didn't understand, but that made both lawyers gather their papers very quickly. She refilled his coffee twice. She rerouted a call from a shipping union representative to the operations floor. She flagged a discrepancy in a Baltimore contract amendment that saved 40 minutes of back and forth at the afternoon review. At 4:30, Helena appeared beside her desk. "He wants to see you," Helena said. "Now." Emily knocked and entered. Damien was standing at the window with his back to her, which she had learned in the past week was how he stood when he was thinking about something difficult. He didn't turn around immediately. "Close the door," he said. She closed it. "Sit down." She sat. He turned. He had the red ledger on his desk open to the page she had shown him Thursday night. Beside it was a printed document covered in handwritten annotations in a tight, precise script that she recognized as his. "I spent the weekend verifying your calculations," he said. She said nothing. "You were right," he said. "Every figure, every transfer path. You were right." He sat down across from her and looked at her in that direct, unblinking way that she had decided was simply how he looked at everything, like he was reading something most people couldn't see. "How did you catch what my financial team missed for 18 months? "Your financial team was probably looking at each account separately," she said. "I was cross-referencing both sides at the same time because that's how the contract amendments are structured. The error isn't visible from one side. It only appears when you hold both columns against each other. And you knew to do that because I was trying to understand the filing system," she said honestly. "I didn't know what I was looking for. I was just trying to understand how everything connected." He was quiet for a moment. "My last 3 secretaries did not try to understand how things connected." "Your last 3 secretaries lasted less than 2 weeks," she said, and then immediately wondered if that had been the wrong thing to say. Something crossed his face. Not offense. Something more like involuntary acknowledgement. "Correct," he said. He looked at the ledger again. The 4 people with system access. I've already begun a separate verification process. I need you to do something for me. Okay, she said. Continue exactly as you have been. File the contracts, schedule the meetings, do your job. He paused. But pay attention to what crosses your desk from those 4 offices. Names, account references, anything unusual. Do not investigate. Do not confront. Just observe and report to me directly. The room was quiet. Emily understood exactly what he was asking. She understood what it meant to be inside this request, what category of involvement it placed her in. She thought about Gloria from her building crossing herself at the mailbox. She thought about $42,000 of medical debt. I can do that, she said. He nodded once the way he acknowledged things that were settled. Then he said without looking up from the ledger, "You're not scared." "I'm extremely scared," she said. "I'm just better at functioning scared than most people." He looked up then, and for a fraction of a second, something in his expression shifted into territory that was not professional, not evaluative, not the controlled calculation she had learned to read in his face. It was something quieter than all of those things, something that surprised even him. Then it was gone. "That will be all, Carter," he said. She stood, nodded, and left. She sat back at her desk and pressed her hands flat against her thighs and told herself firmly that the fractional expression on Damien Moretti's face meant nothing could mean nothing and was not something she was going to think about further. She thought about it for the rest of the afternoon. The 4 people with full system access were Marcus Hale, the CFO, who had been with Moretti Logistics for 9 years, and who communicated primarily through terse emails that Emily had been routing for a week. John Russo, head of port operations, who spoke almost exclusively in Italian, unless addressing someone he considered worth English. Carla Benedetti, senior compliance officer, who was the only woman in the senior leadership and who moved through the floor with the specific efficiency of someone who had earned every inch of their position. And James Whitfield, the corporate legal director, whose office was at the far end of the floor and who dressed impeccably and smiled at Emily every morning in a way that she had initially found reassuring, and now knowing what she knew found she wanted to look at more carefully. She observed, she filed, she paid attention, and the chaos continued. On Tuesday, she spilled an entire tray of printed documents down a stairwell when she misjudged the door handle on the 4th floor landing. The documents scattered across 2 flights, and she spent 20 minutes collecting them, reorganizing them by page number from memory, and reprinting the 3 pages that had somehow ended up wet. What she didn't realize until she was reprinting was that descending to collect the documents had put her on the 3rd floor landing at the exact moment that Marcus Hale was on his phone in the stairwell below her, speaking in a low, urgent voice, clearly believing he was alone. She heard 3 words clearly before she backed away from the railing. "Not yet, Friday." She reprinted the documents. She went back upstairs. She wrote down what she had heard on the notepad she kept in her blazer pocket. On Wednesday, she knocked over a decorative glass paperweight on the credenza outside the operations conference room, and it shattered loudly enough to stop a conversation inside the room for 10 seconds before resuming. She crouched to collect the pieces and heard through the gap at the bottom of the door 2 voices, one of which she recognized as John Russo's discussing a shipment manifest number that she had processed that morning and flagged as pending authorization. That manifest number was not pending because of processing delay. It had been pending because the authorization signature had been deliberately withheld. She wrote the manifest number down beside the stairwell note. She brought both notes to Damien at 6:15 when the floor had cleared. He read them without expression. He put them in his desk drawer without comment. Then he said, "Have dinner." She blinked. "I'm sorry." "You haven't eaten since the banana you had at your desk at noon," he said. "There's food in the executive kitchen. Go eat something." She stared at him. "You noticed the banana." "I notice everything," he said without particular emphasis. "Go eat, Carter." She ate. She sat alone in the executive kitchen at 6:30 eating a plate of food that someone had left covered in the refrigerator with no name on it. And that was frankly better than anything she had cooked herself in 3 months. She sat there and she thought about the fact that the most feared man in New York had noticed she hadn't eaten lunch. She put that in the same mental drawer as his expression from yesterday and closed it firmly. On Thursday, the 10th day of her employment, the thing happened that changed the temperature of everything. She was bringing documents to the compliance office, which was in a secondary corridor off the main executive floor when she turned the corner and walked directly into James Whitfield, coming out of his office in the opposite direction. Papers went everywhere. Emily's tote bag swung off her shoulder and caught a decorative side table which tipped and sent a ceramic planter straight off the edge. She caught the planter. She was as surprised as anyone. Whitfield looked at her with his practiced, reassuring smile. "Good reflexes," he said, reaching down to help gather the scattered papers. "Thank you. I'm so sorry She stopped. Among the papers she was collecting from the floor face up was a document that had come from Whitfield's office. She could tell because it had his letterhead at the top. And the account number visible in the body of the text was a number she had written on her notepad 2 days ago. The same account number from the manifest that had been deliberately withheld. She gathered all the papers without showing her expression. She handed Whitfield's back to him. She apologized again. She walked back to her desk. Her hands were completely steady. She didn't know how. She pulled out her notepad. She wrote Whitfield. Direct document connection. Same account. At 4:55, she received a call on the executive line from a number she didn't recognize. She answered as protocol required. The voice on the other end was male, low-accented in a way she couldn't immediately place. "Tell Moretti," the voice said, "that his secretary is taking a very unhealthy interest in things that don't concern her." The line went dead. Emily sat very still for approximately 4 seconds. Then she stood up, walked to the double doors, knocked once, and opened them. Damien was on a call. He looked up with the expression of someone interrupted, and she held up one finger, which was either extremely professional or extremely bold, and said, "I need 60 seconds. Right now." Something in her face made him end the call. She told him about the phone call, verbatim. He was quiet for a long moment. His hands were flat on the desk. She watched the particular stillness that came over him when he was making a decision, the way all the controlled energy in him gathered toward a single point. "Who knew you were paying attention?" he said. "Only you," she said, "unless someone saw me in the stairwell or the corridor." "Which means the person watching you is one of the 4, he said. "Yes." He stood. He walked around the desk, and for a moment he was standing close enough that she was aware of him in a way she immediately decided to not be aware of, and then he moved past her to the window. "Carter," he said with his back to her. "Yes. From this point forward, you do not take the stairs alone. You do not go to any secondary office without telling Helena your location first. You do not answer the executive line after 5 o'clock. He turned. "These are not suggestions." "I understand," she said. "Do you understand why?" He said, and his voice had something underneath it that was not quite professional concern, but was something adjacent to it, something that she had no clean category for. "Because whoever is stealing from you knows I've seen something," she said. "Yes," he said. "That's one reason." She waited. He didn't say the second reason, but she understood it was there. She nodded. She left. Friday arrived with the specific charged quality of a day that had been building all week. Emily was at her desk at 7:15. She had not slept well. She had dreamed about account numbers and red ledgers and phone calls and empty stairwells, and she had woken at 5 a.m. and lain in the dark running calculations until it was late enough to leave for the subway. At 9 a.m., Marcus Hale came to her desk. He stood in front of it with his hands in his pockets and his CFO expression, the one that communicated that he was accustomed to being taken seriously, and said, "I need you to pull the Q3 port operations summary. Physical copy. Whitfield's office has the master file." Emily looked at him. "I can print a copy from the system." "The system copy is incomplete," he said. "There's an annotated version in Whitfield's office. He said you could retrieve it." She held his gaze for exactly the right amount of time. Not too long, not immediately compliant. "Of course," she said. "Give me a few minutes." She walked to Helena's station first. "I'm retrieving a document from Whitfield's office," she said. "Hale's request." Helena looked at her with the expression of someone who understood subtext. "I'll note it," she said. Emily knocked on Whitfield's door. "Come in." His office was immaculate. He was at his desk, jacket on despite the warmth, and he smiled when she entered. "Emily, Marcus said he'd send you. The summary's on the credenza behind me, left side blue folder." She crossed the room. She found the blue folder. She opened it to confirm it was the right document, which was standard procedure, and gave her approximately 15 seconds of legitimate reason to look at what was in front of her. The Q3 port operations summary was there. So was a handwritten note tucked inside the back cover that read, R confirms Friday transfer. Amount confirmed. Merge accounts Sunday. R. Rossi, Vincent Rossi, the name she had seen in a single brief forum post about Moretti Logistics that she had dismissed as internet speculation. The name she had seen appear in a comment thread attached to a shipping industry article about East Coast port territory disputes. The rival. Emily closed the folder. She turned around. She smiled at Whitfield with the specific, pleasant professional smile she had spent 10 years perfecting. Thank you, Mr. Whitfield. Of course, he said warmly. How are you settling in? First 2 weeks can be an adjustment. Everyone has been very helpful, she said and left. She brought the folder to Hale. She sat at her desk. She wrote 3 words on her notepad and underlined them twice, Whitfield. Rossi, Friday. She looked at the clock. It was 9:47 a.m. At 10:15, she knocked on Damien's door. Come in. She placed the notepad on his desk open to the 3 words. He looked at it. He was still for a long time. When he looked up at her, his face had changed in a way she hadn't seen before. Not anger exactly, though there was anger underneath. Something colder than anger. The expression of a man who had trusted someone for years and was now holding the evidence of what that trust had cost him. How certain are you, he said. The handwriting is Whitfield's. I've processed enough of his documents to recognize it. The note was inside the Q3 folder he personally directed me to retrieve. Damien stood. He walked to the window again, and this time he stayed there longer. She could see the tension across his shoulders. She could see him deciding. Carter, he said. Yes. There is a charity gala on Saturday evening. Executives Port Authority contacts industry leadership. A pause, and others. Another pause waited. I need someone beside me who can identify behavioral inconsistencies. Someone who has proven they can see what trained people miss. He turned. I am asking you to come with me. The room was very quiet. Emily thought about the phone call warning her off. She thought about the note with Rossi's name in Whitfield's handwriting. She thought about $4 million and 18 months of careful theft and the word Friday underlined on her notepad. She thought about her mother telling her that smart was the thing that outlasted everything else. What should I wear? She said. Something moved across Damien's face. Quick, almost invisible. Something that in a different man, in a different world, she might have called relief. Helena will arrange it, he said. She nodded and turned to leave. Carter, he said one more time. She stopped. Yes, he was quiet for a moment, looking at her with that unreadable quality that she had stopped trying to decode and had simply started receiving the way you received weather. Then he said, You've lasted 2 weeks. I'm aware, she said. In 11 years, he said quietly, you are the 3rd person in this organization I have trusted with something real. She didn't ask what happened to the other 2. She nodded. She left. She closed the doors behind her and walked back to her desk and sat down and stared at her screen for a full 30 seconds before she remembered what she was supposed to be doing. Helena appeared at her elbow at 3 o'clock. Mr. Moretti has arranged for a dress for Saturday evening, Helena said. It will be delivered to your address tonight. A pause. He asked me to note that it is green. He said you would understand the relevance. Emily blinked. She had mentioned exactly once in a half sentence during a scheduling call that she had attended her high school prom in a green dress because green was the only color that made her feel like herself. She had mentioned it once in passing over the phone to a Port Authority coordinator while confirming an event color code. He had been on the other side of the office. He had heard. She stared at the calendar on her screen for a very long time. She told herself with great conviction that the green dress meant nothing. She did not believe herself at all. The dress arrived at 8:15 that evening in a garment bag with no brand label visible and fabric that felt like something from a different universe than her second-hand blazer. She hung it in her small closet and stepped back and looked at it. Emerald green, floor length, structured at the shoulder with the kind of simplicity that was more expensive than decoration. She stood in her Brooklyn apartment with the eviction notices in the kitchen drawer and the dead espresso on the counter and her mother's birthday card, and she looked at the green dress in her closet. She thought about what Helena had said that first Thursday, that surviving the week meant something different in other songs. She thought about the note in Whitfield's handwriting, about Rossi, about Friday transfers and merged accounts. She thought about Saturday night in a room full of the most dangerous men on the East Coast, and Damien Moretti standing beside her, asking her to see things trained people missed. She had come to this job to survive debt. She had no language yet for what she was becoming inside it. She closed the closet. She made herself a cup of tea. She sat at the kitchen table and looked at the city through her window. Rain starting again, Brooklyn blurring behind the water. And she understood with a clarity that was almost physical that whatever was coming on Saturday night, the story she had walked into 2 weeks ago, was no longer the story she had thought she was in. It was bigger than a job, bigger than a debt. And the most dangerous part, the part she pressed down firmly and refused to examine directly, was that some quiet, stubborn piece of her did not want to walk away from it. Not from the danger, from him. She drank her tea. She did not sleep. Saturday arrived the way important nights always did, too fast and without mercy. Emily was ready at 6:45, standing in her Brooklyn apartment, in the emerald green dress, holding her small clutch purse, and trying to decide if the person looking back at her from the bathroom mirror was someone she recognized. The dress fit like it had been made for her specifically, which unsettled her because she had never told anyone her measurements, and Helena had simply sent it without asking. Which meant either Helena was extraordinarily perceptive, or Damien had noticed more about her than she had accounted for. She put that thought in the drawer. The drawer was getting crowded. The car arrived at 7 exactly. Black no markings, a driver who opened the door without making eye contact and closed it behind her without speaking. She sat in the back seat and watched Brooklyn dissolve into Manhattan through the tinted window and told herself with great conviction that she was attending a professional event in a professional capacity and that the green dress was simply appropriate attire. The car stopped in front of the Whitmore Grand, which was the kind of hotel that made you feel underdressed just looking at the entrance. Emily stepped out and immediately heard the sound of the city and then immediately heard something else, a low, measured voice beside her. "You're punctual," Damien said. He was standing 3 feet away, dark suit, no tie, and the specific self-possession of a man who had never in his adult life been uncertain about whether he belonged somewhere. He looked at her for exactly the length of time it took to confirm she was there, and then looked forward, which Emily categorized as professional, and did not examine further. "You told me to be ready at 7, she said. "Most people interpret that loosely." "I don't interpret instructions loosely," she said. "That's why I still work for you." He made a sound that was not quite a laugh, but lived in the same neighborhood. Then he said, "Stay close. The people in that room are not what they appear. Several of them know my face very well. A few of them would prefer I didn't have one." She understood what that meant. "What am I looking for?" she said. "Whitfield is inside. Rossi's people are inside. I need to know when they interact, how, and whether any financial exchanges happen that aren't covered by the event's legitimate charity function." He paused. "You see things I miss. That's the only reason you're here." It was the most honest thing he had ever said to her and also the most clinical, and she appreciated both equally. They walked in together. The ballroom was a particular kind of magnificent that felt engineered to make normal people feel small, which Emily supposed was the point. 200 people informal where the ambient sound of calculated conversation, waitstaff moving through the crowd with the precision of people trained to be invisible. Crystal candlelight, and underneath all of it, the specific tension of a room where more than half the conversations had a second meaning. She felt it immediately, the texture of it, the way certain clusters of people angled their bodies away from certain other clusters. The men whose eyes moved too much and the men whose eyes moved too little. The ones performing relaxation versus the ones who were actually relaxed, and how few of the latter category there were. Damien was greeted within 40 seconds by a shipping executive from Baltimore whose handshake lasted 1 beat too long. Emily stood slightly behind his right shoulder and watched the man's left hand. His fingers were moving against his jacket pocket in a tapping pattern that wasn't nervous energy. It was timing. He was counting something. She leaned slightly toward Damien's ear. His left hand, he's counting down to something. She felt rather than saw the fractional shift in Damien's posture. He wrapped up the handshake 90 seconds faster than the Baltimore executive wanted. They moved through the room. James Whitfield was at the East Bar holding a glass of champagne and speaking to a woman in red whom Emily didn't recognize. He saw Damien from across the room and his smile appeared immediately practiced and warm and landing exactly 2 degrees wide of genuine. Emily watched him the way she watched documents, looking for the number that was slightly off. He's already spoken to someone tonight who made him nervous, she said quietly, barely moving her lips. His left shoulder is higher than his right. That's compensation. He's managing something. Damien said nothing, but she could feel him processing it. They were 40 minutes into the event when the first significant moment happened. Emily had drifted slightly to Damien's left, giving herself a broader sight line across the room when she spotted it. A man she didn't know by name, but recognized from an online photograph she had found during her late-night research, dark-haired mid-50s, with the particular physical confidence of someone accustomed to being the most dangerous person in any room he entered, was standing near the event's charity auction display. Vincent Rossi. He was looking directly at Damien, not with hostility, with the calm, evaluative look of a man who had already made a decision and was simply watching his plan proceed. She touched Damien's arm, not dramatically, a light brief pressure, the way you'd signal someone in a library. East wall, auction display, don't look immediately. She felt his arm tense under her fingers. He waited 4 seconds. Then he turned in a way that looked organic, part of a broader scan of the room. His eyes crossed Rossi's position. He held the direction a half-second too long, which no one else would notice, and then he looked away. He's not supposed to be here, Damien said very quietly. There was something underneath the control in his voice that she had not heard before. Not fear, something that had preceded fear in the evolutionary chain. Pure threat recognition. He's watching you specifically, she said. He's been watching me for 2 years, Damien said. The question is what he's watching for tonight. They had their answer in 20 minutes. Emily had positioned herself near the back corridor under the pretense of finding the restroom, which was genuine cover because she actually needed a minute alone to steady herself when she saw Whitfield slip out of the main ballroom through a side door and into the corridor. She counted to 15. She followed. The corridor was dim and long, running behind the main event space with service doors on both sides. She moved quietly in the green dress that was, she noted with private gratitude, not the kind that made noise when you walked. She reached the first corner and stopped. Whitfield was 8 feet away, speaking in a low, rapid voice to a man she didn't recognize, but whose posture and positioning told her immediately he was not a hotel employee. Sunday is too late, Whitfield was saying. Moretti had someone reviewing the Q3 accounts. If she's shown him anything, she hasn't shown him enough, the other man said. You don't know that. She's sharper than she looks. I'm telling you, Rossi needs to move it to tonight. A pause. I'll pass it along, the other man said. Emily had already backed up 3 steps by the time Whitfield turned. She made it to the restroom alcove and stood there with her heart in her throat and her hands completely still at her sides, and told herself with fierce internal discipline to think clearly. Whitfield knew she had been reviewing accounts. He didn't know exactly what she told Damien, but he was scared enough to push up the timeline. Whatever was supposed to happen Sunday was now going to happen tonight. She went back to the ballroom. She found Damien in under 90 seconds, which was faster than she'd expected given the crowd, and she realized with no time to examine it that she had memorized exactly how he moved through a room. She put her hand on his arm again. Pressure, not a touch. We have a problem. He angled toward her immediately. In the noise of the ballroom at the distance, they were standing, no one could hear them. Tell me, she told him, precisely quickly every word she had heard in the corridor. She watched his face and saw the calculation happening behind it, rapid and cold, the way a machine processes a threat assessment without the interference of emotion. He's moving tonight, Damien said. That's what it sounded like. Where is Whitfield now? He came back into the ballroom 3 minutes ago. He's at the North Bar. And Rossi, still East Wall, but he's moved 6 feet closer to the exit in the last 20 minutes. Damien looked at her. In that moment, in the noise and candlelight of the Whitmore Grand's ballroom, surrounded by 200 people who knew his name and a subset who wanted him dead, he looked at Emily Carter from Brooklyn with an expression that had nothing professional in it at all. You tracked his position while managing everything else, he said. I track positions, she said. It's what I do. Something shifted in his face. Quick, involuntary, the same fractional thing she had been refusing to examine for 2 weeks. Stay beside me, he said, not a request. I'm not going anywhere, she said. They moved through the room together with the specific purposefulness of people who know the clock has changed. Damien spoke to 3 people in the next 15 minutes, each conversation brief and surface level. Each one covering a specific piece of business she understood only in outline, but that she could tell was Damien quietly reinforcing his position before something happened. She was watching Whitfield when she saw it. The handoff. Whitfield was standing with 2 other executives near the charity auction items. He reached into his jacket pocket the way anyone might reach for a phone and removed something small that he transferred to the man beside him in the specific smooth palm-to-palm movement that was designed to look like nothing at all. It looked like nothing to everyone else in the room. Emily had spent a decade watching people move things between hands in situations where doing so obviously would cause problems. She had grown up in neighborhoods where certain transactions happened exactly this way. Whitfield just transferred something to the man in the gray jacket beside him, she said quietly. Small, flat, could be a drive or a card. Damien stopped walking. Which man? Blue pocket square, gray jacket. He's the one who's been positioned between you and the east exit for the last hour. A pause. That's Rossi's financial coordinator, Damien said. The weight of that settled between them. So whatever is on that drive or card, Emily said carefully, just crossed from your lawyer to Rossi's money man tonight at a public event. Yes, Damien said. In front of 200 witnesses who weren't looking, she said. Yes. She thought about the ledger, about $4 million in 18 months in 3 shell companies, about Sunday transfers that had just become tonight. It's not just the theft, she said. Something had clicked, the way figures clicked, when the math finally resolved. The money was just the funding. Whitfield has been building something, the accounts, the manifests, the shell companies. It's not about stealing from you. It's about using your own financial infrastructure to fund a takeover. She saw it hit him, the full shape of it landing with the weight of real confirmation. He had suspected, now he knew, and then his phone vibrated. He looked at it. His expression closed off completely, the way a door closes on a room where something dangerous is kept. We need to leave, he said. Now. What happened? My security at the office just flagged a physical entry. He looked up. Someone accessed my private floor during the event. They moved toward the exit. They didn't make it. The valet corridor behind the hotel was dark, caught between the kitchen entrance and the parking structure, and they had made it approximately 30 feet from the hotel's rear door when Emily heard something that her brain processed before her conscious mind caught up with it. The specific sound of weight shifting on pavement in a way that was too deliberate, too coordinated, coming from more than one direction at once. She grabbed Damien's arm. Her foot caught the edge of a drainage lip in the pavement she hadn't seen. She went sideways, and because she was holding his arm, she took him with her, both of them stumbling left and down behind a concrete parking barrier at the exact moment that 3 sharp sounds or cracked through the air from the direction they had been walking. Gunfire. Damien's body was over hers before she had finished processing the sound, his arm around her shoulders pressing her flat, his other hand already reaching inside his jacket. She could hear shouting from somewhere behind them. 2 voices in Italian, and then returning sounds from Damien's security, and then running, and then a car accelerating hard. 30 seconds, maybe 40, then silence. Damien's security reached them in under a minute. 2 men moving fast, weapons visible now and not being hidden. They formed a perimeter around the barrier while a third checked the far end of the alley. Clear, someone said. Damien pulled back from her and looked at her face. It was the most direct he had ever looked at her, with none of the professional distance, none of the evaluation. Just looking at her the way you looked at something you needed to confirm was intact. Are you hurt? He said. No, she said. Her voice was steady. She was genuinely surprised by that. Are you? He shook his head. He was still looking at her. You pulled me down, he said. I tripped, she said. You saved my life, he said. I tripped, she repeated, because the alternative was acknowledging something she had no language for, yet something that was too large and too fast and too real for the alley behind the Whitmore Grand at 9:40 p.m. on a Saturday night. He looked at her for a moment longer. Then he stood and pulled her up with him, his hand around hers, and he did not let go of it while he spoke rapidly in Italian to his security team. She stood beside him in the green dress in the dark alley and felt the specific adrenaline crash of someone who had been 3 feet from bullets and was now standing in silence processing the fact that they were still alive. She was shaking slightly. She pressed her free hand against her thigh to stop it. Damien felt it. He tightened his grip on her other hand without turning, without acknowledging it publicly. Just a small increase in pressure that said, "I know, and I've got you," in a language that required no translation. She stopped shaking. One of the security team was on the phone. She caught one word in the rapid Italian Rossi: confirmation. The car came around from the front of the hotel in under 4 minutes. They were inside before she had time to think about getting inside. Damien was on the phone, immediately low and controlled and in Italian, and she sat beside him in the back seat and looked at her own hands and thought about the sequence: Whitfield's note, Rossi's coordinator, the financial handoff, the office breach, the alley, 3 gunshots. It was not random. None of it was random. It had been coordinated for tonight specifically, which meant the charity gala had been a setup. The event that Damien had chosen to use to expose Whitfield had simultaneously been the event Rossi had chosen to make his move. They had walked into it knowing only half of what was waiting. Damien ended the call. The car was moving fast through Manhattan traffic. He sat back, and for a moment they were both just sitting there, not speaking. The city running past the windows and the silence between them had a different quality than any silence she had experienced in 2 weeks of working beside him. It was not professional silence. It was not evaluative. It was the silence of 2 people who had just been through something real together and were still inside the edges of it. "The office breach," she said finally. "My private floor. Someone accessed the physical filing cabinet in my secondary office." He paused. "The one that contains the original documents corresponding to the accounts you identified in the ledger." "They wanted the originals," she said. "If they have the originals and your copies are digital, they can claim the digital records were fabricated." He turned to look at her. "The financial evidence I built," she said. "If the original physical records disappear, the case for fraud disappears with them. Your own lawyer is the one who could argue that in court. He knows exactly what would need to go missing to make the theft untraceable and the takeover legally defensible." The car hit a red light and stopped, and in the brief stillness, she could see Damien's jaw tighten with the specific tension of someone who had just watched a very large and complicated trap close around them. "We need to know what they took," he said. "We need to know what they didn't take," she said, "because whatever they left behind is what they don't know about." He was quiet for 3 seconds. "The secondary accounts, the ones you found in the subsidiary cross-reference. Those records aren't in the physical filing system. They only exist in the version you reconstructed from the manifest cross-reference, which is on my notepad," she said, "in my apartment in Brooklyn." Another silence. "Carter," he said. "Yes." "How much of what you know exists only in your head and your notepad?" She thought about it. The full weight of what she had built over 2 weeks, the complete picture of the fraud, the account architecture, the transfer paths, the names, the amounts. The portions that had no digital trace because she had built them by hand, by instinct, by the specific accident of being a broke girl from Brooklyn who cross-referenced both ledgers at once because she was trying to understand a filing system. "Most of it," she said. The look on his face in that moment was not admiration exactly. It was something more complicated. The expression of a man who had spent years surrounded by power and resources and trained expertise, suddenly understanding that the most valuable asset in his entire organization was a 24-year-old woman who had caught his accountant's failure by accident and who was currently sitting in the back seat of his car in an emerald green dress after surviving an assassination attempt with her hands steady and her reasoning intact. "You're the only complete record of the evidence," he said. "Yes," she said. "Which means," he said carefully, "that as of tonight, you are not just a witness." She understood what he was saying. "I'm a target," she said. He held her gaze, not with apology. He was past performing apology, with the specific directness of a man who would not lie to someone about their situation when the situation was serious. "Yes," he said. She looked at her hands again. They were completely still. She thought about her mother, about the kitchen drawer full of eviction notices, about the banana she had eaten at her desk for lunch and the cold espresso and the red ledger on the floor behind the credenza, about how she had walked into Moretti headquarters 2 weeks ago with shaking hands and thrift store shoes, convinced she was taking a temporary job to survive 3 more months. She looked up. "Then we need to move fast," she said, Because Rossi thinks he has the physical records and he doesn't know what I have. That's our window. And windows close. Damien looked at her for a long moment. Yes, he said quietly. They do. The car moved through the dark Manhattan streets and outside the windows. The city was indifferent and enormous, and somewhere in it, Whitfield was explaining himself to Rossi, and the physical records were gone, and 3 bullets had just missed Damien Moretti's chest by the width of Emily's stumble. She sat with all of that, and she was afraid, genuinely afraid in the deep structural way that fear operated when the stakes were real and immediate and personal. But underneath the fear, steady and persistent and surprisingly solid, was something else. She was not done. She had not come this far through the debt and the grief and the cold subway mornings and the red ledger and the alley and the green dress and the man sitting beside her who had held her hand in the dark to stop now. She pressed her hands flat on her knees. She started thinking. The penthouse was on the 58th floor of a building in Midtown that had no Moretti Logistics branding anywhere on it, which Emily understood immediately was the point. Damien's security team had her inside and the elevator moving before she had fully processed that they were not going back to Brooklyn. She didn't argue. She had lost the standing to argue the moment Rossi's people put 3 bullets through the air she had been standing in. The space itself was large and spare in the way that belonged to someone who spent very little time there and had not bothered to make it feel like anything. A kitchen, a long table, a wall of windows showing Manhattan in the dark, and a secondary room that Damien's security team immediately swept before anyone else entered. She stood in the main space holding her clutch and realized she was still in the green dress, and that the green dress had now survived a ballroom, a dark alley, and an assassination attempt which felt like something. Damien came in behind her and said 2 sentences in Italian to the security team, who dispersed to positions she couldn't fully track, but felt around the perimeter of the space. He took off his jacket and put it over a chair, and then stood in the kitchen and said without preamble, "Tell me everything you know, in order, from the beginning." She put down the clutch. She sat at the long table, and for the next 40 minutes she told him. Not the condensed version she had given him in pieces over 2 weeks. Everything. The full architecture of what she had reconstructed, starting from the first manifest cross-reference, on her second day through the subsidiary account transfers, the 11-day offset, the shell company loop, the stairwell conversation. Whitfield's quarter exchanged the note with Rossi's name, the handoff at the gala, all of it in order. With the figures she had memorized because she memorized everything important by instinct, the way people who had grown up without reliable systems learned to carry their records inside themselves. He listened without interrupting. He sat across the table and his hands were still, and his attention was complete, and she understood by the end that she had just given him more organized intelligence about his own organization's corruption than anyone had been able to assemble in 18 months. When she finished, he was quiet for a long moment. 4.3 million, he said. Approximately. I don't have the final quarter figures. The takeover mechanism, he said. Walk me through that again. She did. The way the shell company accounts had been structured, not just to move money out, but to establish what would look like a legitimate ownership trail. If Rossi's team filed the right paperwork using the financial infrastructure Whitfield had built, they could argue in court that Moretti Logistics had been operating under a fraudulent ownership structure for 18 months, and that Rossi's consortium was the legitimate successor entity. It was elegant and deeply illegal and would take 2 years of litigation to untangle, even if Damien survived long enough to fight it. Whitfield, Damien said. The word had a specific quality, not anger, the thing that lived on the far side of anger, where everything went cold and flat and completely certain. He's been planning this for at least 2 years, Emily said. Probably longer. The account structure didn't build itself in 18 months. Someone was designing the framework before the first transaction. Damien stood. He walked to the window and stood there the way he did when he was making decisions, and she let him because she had learned over 2 weeks when to speak and when to give him the silence he needed to think. His phone rang. He answered it in Italian, listened for 30 seconds, said 3 words, ended the call. He turned around. They swept the secondary office. The physical files are gone. Everything in the Q3 cabinet and the 2 filing drawers beneath it, which is everything except the subsidiary cross-reference, she said, which exists only in your reconstruction. Yes. He looked at her across the long table in the spare penthouse light, and said something that she had not expected him to say. "I need to ask you something that I have no right to ask." She waited. "I need you to rebuild the complete evidence record. Tonight. From memory." He paused. "Every account number, every transfer date, every shell company name and correspondent bank. The complete picture in a format that can be verified against Port Authority records and banking filings." Another pause, and in it, she heard something that she had never heard in his voice before, something that cost him to put into words. "I am asking you to do something dangerous for me. Knowing what tonight has already been. Knowing that I cannot fully guarantee." "Get me a laptop," she said. He stopped. "And coffee," she said. "Real coffee, not instant. And tell me you have something to eat in this kitchen because I'm still running on the banana from 8 this morning and I need to think clearly." He stood there for a moment that contained something complicated and unspoken, and then he turned to the kitchen and said, "I'll make the coffee myself." She blinked. "You can make coffee?" "Carter," he said, opening a cabinet with the ease of someone who knew where things were. "I grew up in a kitchen in Palermo. I was making espresso before I spoke English." She sat at the table and something happened to her face that she was glad he wasn't looking at. He put a laptop in front of her, 20 minutes later, along with espresso and a plate of food that was better than anything she had a right to expect at 11 p.m. in a safe house, and she started typing. She worked the way she always worked, when something mattered in a focused, forward-moving state where the noise of everything else receded and only the problem existed. Account numbers surfaced from memory and sequence. Transfer dates fell into their correct positions. Shell company names and registration numbers that she had seen once in a document she had processed 3 days ago appeared with the specificity of things her brain had filed without being asked to. Damien sat across from her with his own documents and worked in parallel cross-referencing what she produced against the digital records that hadn't been in the physical cabinet, building the case from 2 directions simultaneously. At one point she said without looking up, "The Cayman routing number for the third shell company. I have the first 8 digits, but the last 4 are uncertain. I saw it once on a transfer confirmation that came through the fax queue." 7743, he said immediately. She looked up. "I signed the original incorporation document," he said. "Whitfield presented it as a subsidiary logistics vehicle 3 years ago. I signed it without knowing what he intended to use it for." His jaw was tight. "I signed my own trap." She looked at him for a moment. "You trusted someone you had reason to trust. That's not stupidity. That's how this kind of fraud works. It requires someone with legitimate access and a long history and the patience to build something over years." He said nothing. "The fact that you trusted him," she said, "doesn't make you responsible for what he did with it." He looked at her in a way that told her no one had said that to him, and also that he wasn't sure he believed it yet, and also that the fact of her saying it meant something he wasn't going to say out loud. 7743, she said and typed it in. "Thank you." They worked until 2 in the morning. At 2:15, she had a complete reconstruction. 47 pages of documented account architecture, transfer records, shell company registrations, and correspondent banking trails, formatted for legal presentation and cross-indexed by date, entity, and transaction amount. She pushed the laptop toward him. He read it. All of it. She watched his face while he read, and she could see the full weight of it arriving, not just the fraud itself, but the scale of the planning, the depth of the betrayal, the specific intimacy of destruction by someone you had employed and trusted for 9 years. When he finished, he closed the laptop. He sat there for a moment with his hands flat on the table. "James Whitfield," he said very quietly, "has been my lawyer since I was 26 years old." She said nothing. There was nothing to say that would make that different. "He was at my father's funeral," Damien said. "He handled my mother's estate." A pause. "He sat beside me at a Senate hearing in 2019 and helped me defend this company against a federal investigation that was ironically also tied to Rossi." The irony of that last part settled in the room like something physical. "He helped you defend against Rossi," Emily said slowly, "while working for Rossi." "Yes." "Which means the Senate investigation 3 years ago was staged," Damien said, "to see how much I knew and to identify which of my people were loyal." His hands tightened on the table edge. "Whitfield used the defense to map my defenses, and I let him." The room was very quiet. Then his phone vibrated again. He looked at it. His expression changed in the specific way it changed when information arrived that moved the timeline. Rossi has called a meeting, he said, tomorrow morning. My captains, my port managers, 3 senior operations directors. He's presenting what he's calling a succession document, using the financial records his people took from my office tonight as supporting evidence. Emily understood what that meant. Rossi wasn't waiting for litigation. He was going to walk into a room full of Damien's own people and present a case that Damien had lost legitimate control of his own company, backed by physical documents that now existed only on Rossi's side of the equation. Without the counter evidence, without the reconstruction she had just spent 3 hours building. What time, she said. 10 a.m., the operations center in Red Hook. Then we have 7 hours, she said. He looked at her. You need someone who can present the financial reconstruction in a format those people will understand, she said. You need someone who can walk a room through 47 pages of account architecture and make it clear in real time. You need someone who has spent 2 weeks cross-referencing both sides of this and can answer questions about it in the moment. She paused. You need me in that room, she said. He was quiet for a long moment. She could see him weighing it, the practical necessity against something else, something that she understood was not professional calculation, something that was the expression of a man who had spent 20 minutes making coffee in a safe house kitchen at midnight and was now being asked to take the person he had been trying to keep out of the crossfire and walk her directly back into it. Carter, he said. I know what I'm walking into, she said. I knew what I was walking into when I picked up the red ledger. I knew what I was walking into when I knocked on your door at 9:30 on a Thursday night. She held his gaze. I'm not asking for your permission. I'm telling you what needs to happen. Something shifted in his expression, something deep and genuine and completely unguarded for exactly 1 second before he brought it back under control. You're telling me, he said. Yes. You're telling me, he repeated, and there was something in his voice that was not professional at all, that was almost something like wondering. Someone has to, she said. He looked at her for a moment that felt longer than it was. Then he said, get some sleep. There's a room at the end of the hall. I'll have someone bring you appropriate clothes for the morning. She stood. She picked up her clutch. She paused. Damien, she said. It was the first time she had used his name. They both heard it. Neither of them acknowledged it directly because acknowledging it directly would have required a conversation neither of them was ready for. He looked at her. What happened to the other 2 people you trusted with something real, she said. You mentioned 3, 11 years. A long pause. One retired, he said. He's in Sicily. He's safe. Another pause heavier. The other one made the mistake of trusting someone I had not verified. What happened to them? She didn't survive it, he said. The room was very still. Emily held his gaze. I'm not going to make that mistake, she said. No, he said quietly. You're not. He said it with the certainty of someone stating a fact not offering comfort. Because I'm not going to let you. She went to sleep in a room she didn't know, in a city that was trying to kill her, and slept 4 hours with the completeness of someone whose nervous system had finally run out of adrenaline and simply shut down. She woke at 6:15 to the sound of a phone on the nightstand, a text from a number she didn't recognize that said only, they know where you are, move in the next 30 minutes or don't move at all. She was dressed and at the door of the main room in 4 minutes. Damien was already up, already dressed, already on the phone. He saw her face and ended the call immediately. Someone sent me a message, she said and showed him the phone. He read it. His jaw tightened. This number is from inside my security team. He was dialing before she finished the sentence. The call connected and he spoke 4 rapid sentences in Italian and listened and said one word that she had come to understand was his equivalent of a full paragraph of profanity and ended the call. 2 of my security team have been on Rossi's payroll, he said. They flagged our location 40 minutes ago. How long do we have? 20 minutes, maybe less. There was no panic in the room. That was the thing that she would remember later. In a different situation with different people, there would have been panic, the kind that spread and fed itself and made everything worse. Instead, there was just rapid, clear forward motion. The laptop, she said, the reconstruction, already transferred to 2 separate secure servers, he said, encrypted. He was moving while he spoke, reaching inside a cabinet she hadn't noticed for something she didn't look at directly. We need to move. Where, Red Hook, he said. We're not waiting for 10 a.m. She stopped. We're going early. If we arrive before Rossi's people have fully set up, before the meeting has officially begun, before the narrative is established, we change what the meeting is. He looked at her. You told me we had a window because Rossi doesn't know what you have. The window closes the moment he walks into that room with those documents. So we walk in first, she said. Yes. In front of his people, and your people, and everyone who's been told since last night that you're either dead or finished. Yes, he said. She thought about it for exactly the time it deserved. I need 5 minutes to go over the 47 pages one more time. You have 3, he said. She sat at the table and opened the laptop, and she didn't read the pages exactly. She experienced them the way you experience something you've built yourself from memory, confirming the structure was intact, that the sequence held that everything she might be asked to explain in a room full of hostile and frightened men, she could explain clearly and without hesitation. 3 minutes. Ready, she said. They were in the car at 6:44 a.m., a different car, a different driver moving through early Sunday morning Manhattan when the city was quiet and the streets had the strange, temporarily peaceful quality of a world that hadn't started the day's damage yet. Emily sat in the back seat with the laptop on her knees and her hands steady and her heart beating at a rate she was managing through deliberate, measured breathing. Damien was on the phone beside her, conducting 3 calls in the 15-minute drive to Red Hook, coordinating something she understood only in pieces, but that told her he had not spent the night only making coffee and reviewing documents. He had been working his own network, contacting people she had not met, calling in verifications and loyalties and moving pieces she couldn't see. He ended the last call as they crossed into Red Hook and looked at her. The people in that room this morning, he said. Some of them are going to be shocked that I'm alive. Some of them are going to be asleep. And some of them are going to be angry that their plan failed. I'll know which is which within the first 2 minutes, she said. He looked at her. Body language positioning and where their eyes go when they first see you walk in, she said. The shocked ones look at your face. The relieved ones look at your hands. The angry ones look at the door. A long pause. How do you know that, he said. I grew up watching people figure out what to do next in a room where the situation just changed, she said. It's the same in every neighborhood. He was quiet. Then, what do you need from me when we're in there? Give me the room when I'm presenting, she said. Don't interrupt and don't explain. When I put a figure in front of them, let it stand on its own. The moment you start interpreting the evidence, it looks like advocacy. If I present it, it's testimony. You've thought about this, he said. I've been thinking about it since 2 a.m., she said. He looked at her with that expression she had been refusing to categorize for 3 weeks, and she looked back and did not look away, and the car pulled up to the Red Hook Operations Building, and the moment ended and they got out. The building was a converted warehouse that served as Moretti Logistics' operational headquarters for the New York Port Network. It was 7:05 in the morning, and there were already 6 cars in the lot, which meant 6 people who had been called to a 10 a.m. meeting had arrived 3 hours early, which meant Rossi's preparation had started at dawn. Damien's hand was at the small of her back as they walked to the entrance. Not holding, not guiding, just there, present. The way you kept a hand near something you were not going to allow to be taken from you. She walked through the door beside the most dangerous man in New York. Behind the door was a large conference table with 8 men who had not expected to see Damien Moretti walk through the door alive, and with a woman in an emerald green dress holding a laptop. The silence was absolute. She looked at their faces in sequence. Shocked. Relieved. Relieved. Angry. Shocked. Working to appear neutral, but failing. Relieved. And the last one at the far end of the table looking not at Damien's face or his hands, but directly at the door behind him, as though calculating what the exit situation now was. She placed the laptop on the table. She opened it. She looked at the 8 men and she said in the same clear, direct, steady voice she had used to walk Damien through the red ledger on a Thursday night 3 weeks ago. Gentlemen, my name is Emily Carter. I am Mr. Moretti's executive secretary, and I have 47 pages of documented evidence that I need to walk you through before someone arrives here this morning with a very convincing lie. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. And then Damien sat down at the head of the table, and in that single action, in the physical reality of a man who was supposed to be finished sitting down and taking up space with the absolute certainty of someone who has never genuinely considered the possibility of being finished, the temperature of the room changed. Emily began to speak. The 8 men at that table had not expected a 24-year-old woman in an evening gown to be the most dangerous person in the room. Emily had learned the most reliable advantage she had ever possessed. She started with the numbers because numbers did not require anyone to trust her. Numbers existed independent of who she was, where she came from, what she was wearing, or what they thought about her presence in a room that had never contained someone like her. She pulled up the first page of the reconstruction, and she read the account numbers aloud slowly and clearly, the way you read something to people who needed to follow without getting lost. Moretti Logistics subsidiary account registered Cayman Islands June of 2 years ago, she said. Opening balance 0. First deposit 11 days after the Q2 manifest cycle closed $412,000. Source routing number ending 7743 traced through 2 correspondent transfers to a shell entity registered in Delaware under the name Atlantic Meridian Holdings. She looked up. The 8 men were looking at her with varying expressions. The man at the far end, who had been watching the door, had stopped watching the door and was now watching her instead with the specific attention of someone recalibrating a threat assessment. Good, she thought. Pay attention. Atlantic Meridian Holdings, she continued, does not appear in any Moretti Logistics vendor registry, approved supplier list, or contracted partner documentation for any fiscal year in the company's operating history. She clicked to the next page. It does, however, appear as a registered co-signatory on a legal instrument filed 18 months ago by the Office of James Whitfield, Corporate Legal Director, in connection with what was described to Mr. Moretti as a subsidiary logistics vehicle. The man 2 seats to her left, one of the port operations directors she had identified in her first 30 seconds as genuinely loyal, based on the way his eyes had gone immediately and with visible relief to Damien's face when they walked in, leaned forward. Are you saying Whitfield set this up from inside? I'm saying the documentation says that, Emily said. I'm not asking you to take my word for anything. I'm asking you to follow the numbers. She kept going. Page by page, account by account, transfer by transfer, she walked them through 18 months of architecture that had been designed to be invisible and was now in the early morning light of a Red Hook warehouse at 7:30 a.m. completely visible. She answered 3 questions from the operations director. She answered 2 from a man on the left who introduced himself as the New Jersey port captain and who had the manner of someone who had been in this business long enough to recognize what clean documentation looked like. She answered none from the man at the far end who had gone very still in the way that people went still when they were deciding what their options were. At 7:52, the door opened. Vincent Rossi walked in with 2 men behind him and James Whitfield at his left. The moment froze. Rossi's eyes went to Damien first. Something crossed his face that was not surprise exactly. He was too controlled for pure surprise, but the calculation behind his eyes recalibrated visibly the way a chess player's expression shifts when a piece they assumed was off the board reappears in a position they hadn't planned for. Then his eyes went to Emily, and then to the laptop, and then to the 47 pages open on the screen. And she watched him understand in real time what he was looking at. Whitfield's face went gray. Mr. Rossi, Damien said from the head of the table in a voice that was perfectly controlled and contained the specific quality of someone who had been expecting exactly this entrance. You're early. We started without you. Rossi stood in the doorway for 3 seconds that contained a significant amount of compressed decision-making. Then he walked fully into the room and sat down because sitting down was the only move that preserved any appearance of control, and Rossi was a man who understood optics. Whitfield did not sit down. He stood near the door with the posture of someone whose body had not yet received permission from his brain to decide what to do. Emily looked at him. Mr. Whitfield, she said in the same clear professional voice she had used for the entire presentation. I'm on page 23, the section covering the Atlantic Meridian co-signatory filing. Would you like me to start from the beginning for your benefit, or would you prefer to acknowledge the documentation as presented? The room held its breath. Whitfield looked at Damien. Something desperate moved through his expression, the specific anguish of a man who had spent years building a version of himself in someone else's eyes, and was now watching that version collapse in real time. Damien, he said. Don't, Damien said. One word. Flat and final, the way you closed a door. Whitfield stopped. Emily continued to page 24. The next 40 minutes were the most concentrated silence Emily had ever worked inside. Rossi sat through the presentation with the external composure of a man who had survived difficult rooms before and understood that reacting visibly was a form of losing. But she watched his hands, and she watched the specific tightening around his eyes at page 31. When she reached the section where the shell company ownership trail led not just to Rossi's financial coordinator, but to a holding structure that put Rossi's own name on a beneficial ownership certificate that his lawyers had apparently believed would never surface. She reached that page and she heard the faintest sound from the man at the far end of the table, the one who had been watching the door, and she understood from the sound that he was not one of Damien's people and had not been for some time. She kept going. At page 38, the New Jersey port captain stood up and said to no one specific, "I've been in this business for 26 years and I've never seen documentation this clean." "Where did this come from?" "From me," Emily said. "I reconstructed it from memory and cross-reference over the course of one night." He looked at her. Then he looked at Damien. Then he sat back down and said nothing more, but his posture had changed into the posture of a man who had made a decision and was now simply waiting for the room to catch up to it. At page 43, Rossi spoke for the first time. "This is manufactured evidence," he said. His voice was even, practiced. "Assembled by an employee with no verifiable credentials, no forensic accounting certification, and a clear personal interest in her employer's outcome." Emily looked at him. She had been expecting this. "You're correct that I'm not a forensic accountant," she said. "I'm a secretary, which is why the reconstruction I presented doesn't ask you to trust my analysis. It asks you to trust the account numbers, transfer dates, and registration documents, all of which are independently verifiable through the Cayman Islands Financial Registry, the Delaware Incorporation Database, and the Federal Reserve Correspondent Banking Records." She clicked to the final page. "I've included the verification pathways for each. Any forensic accountant you choose to hire will arrive at the same conclusions. The only question is whether you'd like to spend the next 18 months in litigation discovering that, or whether you'd like to accept what the documents already show." Rossi looked at her for a long moment. She looked back. She did not blink. Something shifted in Rossi's expression. Not defeat exactly. The specific moment when a man who has spent 20 years being the most dangerous intelligence in a room recognizes that the intelligence across from him is operating at a level he had not accounted for and has the particular self-awareness to know it. He looked at Whitfield. Whitfield was still standing near the door, and he had the appearance of a man whose body had been running on adrenaline and was now simply empty. "James," Rossi said, "one word, not warm." Whitfield looked at him and something broke in his face. "I did everything you asked," he said, and his voice had the specific quality of a man who had just realized that the person he had betrayed everything for was now looking at him like a liability. 2 years, I did everything. "And yet," Rossi said in a tone that was final. Whitfield's face went through several things in rapid succession that Emily watched with the particular attention of someone who understood that what she was seeing was a man discovering in real time that he had traded everything for nothing. Damien stood. The room responded to it immediately, the way rooms respond to the movement of the person who holds the actual gravity. Chairs shifted, postures adjusted. 8 men plus Rossi's 2 associates plus Whitfield, all oriented toward the head of the table where Damien Moretti stood, with the complete unhurried certainty of someone who had never genuinely ceded control of the room. "The documentation Miss Carter has presented will be filed with the appropriate federal authorities within the hour," Damien said. "The subsidiary accounts have been frozen as of 6 this morning through emergency injunction. The beneficial ownership certificate connecting Mr. Rossi's holding structure to Atlantic Meridian has been forwarded to the Eastern District U.S. Attorney." He paused. "The physical documents removed from my office last night have been reported as stolen to the NYPD, with surveillance footage from the building identifying the individuals who removed them." Rossi was very still. "James," Damien said, and looked at Whitfield with something that was the most complicated expression Emily had seen on his face. Something that had grief underneath the control and underneath the grief. Something that might have been distantly the remnant of the thing you feel when a person who has been beside you for years turns out to be someone else entirely. "You'll want to contact a lawyer, not me." Whitfield said nothing. He looked at the floor. Two of Damien's security appeared at the door, which told Emily they had been positioned there for some time and that Damien had known approximately how this morning would end when they drove to Red Hook at 6:44 a.m. He had walked her into a room knowing the outcome, not because he had been certain of victory, because he had been certain of her. The realization arrived quietly the way important things often did not, with drama but with the specific weight of something true settling into its permanent place. Rossi stood. He looked at Damien. "This isn't finished," he said. "Yes, it is," Damien said. "You just haven't accepted it yet." Rossi left with his associates. The man at the far end of the table left immediately after, and two of Damien's security followed him out. The room began the process of reassembling itself around the new reality, the port captain asking questions, the operations director on the phone, already people moving with the specific energy of a crisis that had resolved into a direction they could work with. Emily closed the laptop. She sat back in her chair for the first time in 40 minutes and let herself feel what she had been managing beneath the presentation, the exhaustion, the adrenaline, the very distant but persistent awareness that she had not slept more than 4 hours and that she was still in the green dress and that she had just walked a room full of the most dangerous men on the East Coast through 47 pages of evidence she had built from memory in a safe house kitchen at 2 in the morning. Helena appeared at her elbow, which was startling because Helena had not been there moments before and Emily had no idea when she had arrived. Helena placed a cup of coffee in front of her, looked at her expression, and said with uncharacteristic simplicity, "Well done, Item." Emily drank the coffee. Damien sat back down across from her when the room had mostly cleared. The operations director was still on the phone in the far corner. Helena had moved to the door. It was approximately 8:45 a.m., and the morning outside had the quality of a day that had already contained significantly more than most days managed. He looked at her across the table. "How are you?" he said. It was such a simple question that for a moment she didn't know what to do with it. Not "how did it go?" Not "are you ready for what comes next?" Not the professional follow-up. Just "how are you?" "Tired," she said honestly, "and I need to go home and get different clothes because I've been in this dress for 14 hours. Something moved across his face that she recognized now as the involuntary expression that appeared when she said something that cut through every layer of the world they had been operating in and arrived at the simple truth underneath. It was the expression she had been refusing to name for 3 weeks, and that she was in this moment too tired to refuse anymore. "I owe you something," he said. "You pay me $4,000 a week," she said. "We're current." "That's not what I mean," he said. She met his eyes. "I know what you mean." The table between them was quiet for a moment. "Emily," he said. Her name. First name. She had used his once in the penthouse and now he used hers in the same deliberate way, the way you use a name when you mean the specific person and not just whoever is in the role. "Yes," she said. "What you did last night and this morning," he said, "the reconstruction, the presentation, what you've done for the past 3 weeks." He stopped and she could see him choosing words with the particular care of someone who did not say personal things easily and was not going to say them carelessly. "I have operated in a world for 12 years where every person around me was performing something, performing loyalty, performing trust, performing competence." He paused. "You never performed anything." "I was too scared to perform anything," she said. "I was just trying to survive." "I know," he said. "That's what made it real." The operations director finished his phone call and moved toward them with questions, and the moment closed the way moments did, but it closed differently from the way moments had been closing between them for 3 weeks. Not unfinished, not deferred, just moved the way something moves when it has found its place and no longer needs to be held in tension. The weeks that followed were the fastest and strangest of Emily's life. The federal filing moved through channels at a speed that told her Damien had relationships inside those channels that he had spent years building and had used very sparingly. The Cayman accounts were formally frozen within 72 hours. Rossi's beneficial ownership documentation became the subject of a federal investigation that the news described as one of the most significant organized crime financial cases on the East Coast in a decade, which Emily read about on her phone on the subway to work and found slightly surreal given that she had built the initial evidence structure on a laptop at 2 a.m. in a safe house. Whitfield was arrested on a Tuesday morning. Emily heard about it from Helena, who delivered the information with the specific neutral expression she used for all significant information, and then added, "Mr. Moretti would like to see you when you have a moment." She had a moment. The man at the far end of the red hook table, whose name she learned was Pavel Dudek, turned out to have been feeding information to Rossi for 11 months and was dealt with in ways that Emily did not ask about and that Damien did not describe, which she understood as a courtesy. The two security team members who had flagged the penthouse location were gone from the organization within 48 hours. Their replacements were introduced to Emily specifically, which told her something about the position she now occupied. The $42,000 of medical debt was gone from her account by the third week of November. She discovered this when she checked her balance on a Monday morning and found a zero where a number she had been living with for 14 months had been. She stared at her phone for a long time. She walked into Damien's office without knocking, which she had never done before. He looked up. "The medical debt," she said. He held her gaze without expression. "You can't do that," she said. "It's done," he said. "Damien." His name again, the way she used it when she meant the specific person and not the professional relationship. "Your mother's illness was not your debt to carry," he said. "You carried it because no one else was there to carry it with you." He looked at her steadily. "That has changed." She stood in the doorway, and the specific weight of 14 months of a number she had carried like a stone shifted off her in a way that was not dramatic and not small, and that she did not have any clean words for. "Thank you," she said. "Sit down, Carter," he said, and then quieter, "Emily." She sat. "I need to tell you something," he said. He was using the voice he used when something was real and not professional. She had learned to tell the difference weeks ago. The position of executive secretary. "If you're firing me because of what happened," she said, "I want to be clear that I stand by everything." "I'm not firing you," he said. She stopped. "I'm dissolving the position," he said. She waited. "The role of executive secretary reports to the CEO," he said. "It exists at a professional distance that I am no longer able to maintain with any integrity." He looked at her directly without the professional layer, without the evaluation, without any of the controlled distance she had spent 3 weeks learning to navigate. Just him. Just honest. "I cannot have you beside my desk. The professional structure we've been operating in has become insufficient for what this actually is." The room was very quiet. "What is this actually?" she said. Steady, direct, her voice did not shake. "Something I have not had before," he said, "and am not going to pretend I'm indifferent to." He paused. "I am asking Emily, not arranging, not deciding, asking." She looked at him across the desk that she had sat beside every day for 3 weeks through espresso and red ledgers and green dresses and gunfire and 47 pages built from memory in a room full of dangerous men and a debt that was gone now and a drawer full of eviction notices that she hadn't checked in a week because she hadn't needed to. She thought about her mother, who had told her that smart was the thing that outlasted everything else, and who had also told her once when Emily was 16 and convinced that being careful was the same as being safe, that the only things worth having were the ones that cost you something to reach for. "You'll have to stop calling me Carter," she said. Something happened to his face that she had never seen before in its full form. Something unguarded and certain and real, the expression of a man who had spent 12 years behind walls that he had built deliberately and well, and who had just in this moment decided he was done building them. "Emily," he said. "Yes," she said, not as an answer to the question, though it was that too, as a beginning. The specific yes that opened something rather than closing it. She had walked into Moretti headquarters 3 weeks ago with shaking hands and second-hand shoes and a banana in her bag and a drawer full of notices that said her life was ending. She had been terrified and in debt and entirely alone in the specific way that people were alone when the person they loved most was gone and the world hadn't paused for any of it. She had found a red ledger on the floor of an executive hallway. She had knocked on a door at 9:30 at night and told the truth to a man who hadn't heard the truth in years. She had worn a green dress into a ballroom where someone wanted her dead and walked out of an alley where bullets had crossed the air and sat in a safe house kitchen at 2 a.m. building evidence from memory and stood at a conference table at 7:30 a.m. and spoken clearly into a silence full of dangerous men who hadn't expected her. She hadn't done it to be powerful. She hadn't done it to be saved. She hadn't done it to become anything other than what she already was. She had done it because it needed to be done, and she was the one who could see how. That was the thing her mother had known and tried to tell her. That the people the world overlooked weren't weak. They weren't limited. They were simply waiting for the moment when what they had always been became impossible to ignore. Emily Carter from Brooklyn, 24 years old, debt cleared and drawer empty, in green dress hung in a closet in a penthouse that was not her apartment, and was in ways she was only beginning to understand becoming something more than a safe house, had not set out to change anything. She had set out to survive. What she had done instead was something larger and quieter and more permanent than survival. She had walked into the most dangerous world in New York and shown it something it hadn't seen before. Not fearlessness. She had been afraid every single day. Not strength. She had been exhausted and underpaid and running on cold coffee and borrowed time. What she had shown, it was something simpler and harder to fight than either of those things. She had shown it that the truth held clearly in the hands of someone who refused to put it down was the most dangerous thing in any room. Damien Moretti, feared by every person in his world, trusted by almost none of them, had spent 12 years building an empire on the correct understanding that power required control and control required distance, and distance required never letting anything real get close enough to cost him something. He had not planned for a girl who dropped things. He had not planned for espresso spilled on an Italian suit and a red ledger found behind a credenza and a woman who knocked on his door at 9:30 at night with the truth in her hands and the specific unglamorous courage of someone who had nothing left to lose and therefore nothing to perform. He had not planned for Emily, and that in the end was the only plan that had ever worked. She sat across from him in the office at the top of the building on a November morning, with the city below them and the empire intact and the lies burned down to nothing, and she looked at him with the clarity of someone who had earned every inch of this moment through 3 weeks of fear and intelligence and sovereign, unshakable honesty. He had fired her as his secretary because he no longer wanted her beside his desk. He wanted her beside his life. And for the first time in 12 years, Damien Moretti had decided that wanting something real was not a weakness. It was the only thing in the end that had ever made him stronger.